I just realized my mic was muted. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of the UETH Weekly Workshop. Today we have a fun topic for you all. We are talking about DeSci, aka decentralized science. So DeSci is still in its infancy, but it's a growing movement with a number of scientists and founders now leveraging blockchain tools to try and improve modern science. Collectively, this work has become known as the Decentralized Science Movement, or DeSci. So first, we have a guest with us tonight. Meet Sava Kurdamadil. Kurdamadidi. I am really having trouble speaking your last name, Sava. I am so sorry. But we have Sava. He is one of the founders who saw the potential of Web3 to fund research on off-patent drugs. And in this session titled Blockchain for Healthcare, Open Source Medicines as Public Goods, we're giving you tangible examples of how the DeSci movement is enhancing the scientific funding experience and providing an alternative to profit-hungry players. And so I'm Tina. I'm your UETH host for the evening. I've been an early stage venture investor for the past 5 years and most recently focused on crypto. And prior to that, I got my career started in product and strategy. For the first part of this session, we're going to start off with Sava's background. He's going to talk a bit about the problem he's looking to solve with his companies, which is making off-patent medical therapies viable. And we'll also hear where blockchain comes in and get a glimpse of what other players are doing in this space. So as a reminder, this is a recorded session, and to be considered an active UETH chapter, please have your members comment within 24 hours of this workshop in our Discord. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop it in our general channel. We can also address any questions we don't cover in this section asynchronously. But if you have any questions, we'll do our best to get to those. And so here at the University of Ethereum, of course, our intention with all these workshops is to inspire you with real life examples so that you can jump into projects to learn by doing. So as you learn more about DeSci, I challenge each and every one of you to reflect on how to make a tangible difference using the knowledge you're gaining today. So I'm going to bring up Sava. First off, Sava, I'm sorry. Please tell me how to pronounce your last name.
Yeah, no, it's a tricky one. 12 letters, so fair enough. Kurdamalidis. But yeah, that's
Kurdamalidis. Got it.
That's yeah.
Well, Sava, you're the CEO of two companies. One is Public Good Pharma, and the other is Crowdfunded Cures. Would love if you could share a bit more about these two companies, what they do, and how they interact.
Yeah, so Crowdfunded Cures was the first one. It's actually a charity I set up just before doing my thesis on this particular topic. So I got into this space probably around 10 years ago, the idea of financial innovation and like different incentives basically for medical innovation. At the time, my fiance had got quite sick, and I was looking online to see kind of what treatments might help, and it's a relatively common thing to people sort of go and they try and see what treatments might be out there, and often a lot of the treatments that patients talk about that are really effective don't have a lot of medical evidence to support them, and things like off-patent drugs or diets or supplements. You go to your doctor, and a lot of the times, because those treatments aren't profitable, like basically you can't wrap a business model around, say, a diet to treat cancer or something like that, or a disease, then there's not really many clinical trials and support. It's only really public funding or government funding, and those trials tend to be quite small. And so really focused on that area of like, how do we look at the way that medicine is being funded, and particularly under the patent system, and how that might sort of skew research in the wrong direction. And then later on actually set up or Crowdfunded Cures kind of I took a bit of a break it was originally like looking at crowdfunding a prize basically for showing medical research that shows these low cost therapies are effective, what I call unmonopolizable therapies. And then sort of later on in the Web3 side of things, as that started picking up, I got into the DeSci space, and sort of a lot of the things that scientists are talking about is essentially around these misaligned incentives and essentially not getting funding for research at the right time or the right kind of research. So there's a lot of synergies around that. And then more recently, Public Good Pharma was actually set up sort of by the charity as more on the Web2 side of things. We were really looking at working with health insurers to build a kind of business model around essentially funding these kinds of therapies, where essentially the business model is built on the cost savings you generate. So if you can say you can generate a bunch of cost savings for a health insurer, and they'll pay you a percentage of those cost savings, and that is used to fund the clinical research, say if it was an off-patent drug or a diet. So that's kind of like one of them's kind of Web3 and the other one's more kind of Web2, and we're kind of trying to bridge the two.
Very cool. What did you do before you started these companies? Would love if you could share a bit more about your background.
Oh yeah, so yeah, I mean, I've been working mainly in-house as an in-house lawyer in the commercial and IP space, also a patent attorney. So yeah, we're working a lot with technology companies, and that's kind of, I think that's what I can kind of bring to the table, where looking at, how do you commercialize research? Basically, how do you commercialize ideas and medical research? And if you can't commercialize it, if there's no business model around it, then essentially that no one wants to fund it, even if it could be very effective. But I think that's helped me a lot with kind of conceptualizing a lot of these, I guess, the gaps, and where we can maybe fill those gaps using these new kinds of ways of coordinating.
Super interesting background. I'm also really curious how you were first introduced to crypto and the DeSci movement, and what you found the most compelling about either the technology or DeSci as a category.
Yeah, so I mean, I've always been really sort of, I think through my older family, my family have been always interested in tech and technology, and they sort of were really kind of adopters around in the crypto space. And then I kind of was helping them on the legal side of things. And but the thing that really attracted me to crypto generally is the idea that you can kind of coordinate over. I was really interested in the governance aspect and how you could sort of coordinate multiple people and have them incentives aligning, like everyone kind of has this particular token, and all of a sudden everyone's aligned with basically making the token do as well as possible. And obviously the fundraising aspect was really interesting. You could raise kind of $300 million in 30 seconds and all over the world. So that was really, the sort of ICO days were pretty interesting, and I was helping a few projects around that time, and I kind of got involved, I guess, helping on the legal side of things, and that's when I kind of came across a few DeSci projects, including VitaDAO, and essentially, I think it's a really interesting situation where you've got a lot of scientists, I think, very smart people, but they're very frustrated and also very undercapitalized, underpaid, particularly in academia, and they're kind of forced to do this publish or perish thing, where essentially they're not really rewarded for the quality of the data or the outputs, but actually, just for basically publishing in the most high impact journals they can. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for DeSci essentially, or Web3, to do a lot of good and to help fix a lot of those misaligned incentives around, particularly around academia. And then on the other side, which is I'm more interested in as well, is sort of the dark side of big pharma, where you basically spend your whole life kind of making a tweaked version of some blockbuster drug that another heart pill that people don't really need, but it makes a lot of money. And your research, and you might have some very valuable research that's just ignored. So it's kind of, you're stuck between these kind of two different models, and I think DeSci, would be a really great way to kind of bridge between those two areas. Yeah.
Well, very cool. We're going to learn a lot about DeSci tonight. And DeSci is a very, very new area in crypto. I was looking up the origin of DeSci, and there's not exactly a moment where DeSci first occurred, but some sources note that it was as early as like 2022 at ETH Denver, where the first gathering of DeSci track came together. Or like a track dedicated to DeSci, I mean, happened at a conference. And so what we're discussing tonight is extremely new. And now that the audience knows a bit more about you, Sava, would love to dive into your talk. So Sava will basically present a challenge that he's looking to disrupt in Web 2 and introduce where blockchain concepts come in. He'll highlight some of the advantages of blockchain while sharing tangible examples of what projects are doing in this space for DeSci. And I'll let you take it away, Sava. We'd love if you could put your slides on the stage and walk through the presentation.
Yeah, okay. So this is, yeah, you guys can see the slides, okay? Yeah, so essentially we're going to be talking about this idea, or what I was thinking originally, and is around funding public goods or open source medicines as public goods, essentially. There's a lot of medicines, as I mentioned, low cost, off patent drugs or diets or supplements, which are essentially public goods because they lack a business model, and yeah, how blockchain can help that. So yeah, the problem is we've got a massive cost issue with healthcare costs, particularly in the United States. You've got 20% of US GDP is being spent on healthcare. It's around $4.5 trillion now per annum. Also, the cost of generating new drugs is also getting more and more expensive. It's well over $1 billion per drug if you count all the failures and the 10 to 15 years it takes to get a new drug, and it's getting more and more expensive over time. So you sort of, yeah, the current system is probably not going to be sustainable, as particularly as people are getting older and baby boomer generation is getting older. And that's led to this idea of financial toxicity, particularly in the States, where 42% of cancer patients will lose all of their assets within 2 years of diagnosis. And new drugs are over $200,000 per year. Medical debts are implicated in the majority of bankruptcies. And also a lot of the new drugs are just not really that effective compared to the older drugs. And then also for employees, their wages are basically flattened because their health care, the amount that they have to pay for their health insurance is increasing over time. And this is also an issue actually in foreign countries, what they call socialized medicine or single payer countries, where the drugs are paid for by the government. But often what happens is that there's very few of those drugs that are actually available to people, to patients overseas, and because they can't afford them, particularly in low and middle income countries. So the problem is that there's this thing called the patent cliff, where essentially pharmaceutical companies will make money from a drug, from a new molecule, as long as it's patentable. But then as soon as it goes off patent, essentially the price kind of drops to almost essentially where you can't really make much of a profit from it. So drug companies are really only interested in new patented drugs. And that leads to this problem where drug companies and pharmaceutical companies and essentially doctors, which rely on those new medicines to treat people, do not, like, the whole purpose, the whole idea of drug development is that you should be putting patients first. But what ends up happening is that patents actually become more important than patients, and a lot of drugs are actually not patentable, or they're off patent, or they're very low cost, or you can't really use patents effectively. So you've got a lot of missed opportunities and potentially harming a lot of patients. And as I was saying, this is because of these missing incentives. Essentially, pharmaceutical companies will not fund large clinical trials for say, off-patent drugs, and once they go off patent, they're off patent forever, essentially, and they can be used for very low cost, and they could treat new diseases, but they're actually ignored most of the time, unless you can reformulate them, which is often not necessary, and sometimes doesn't actually benefit the patient. Also, what we were saying before is the new drugs cost a lot of money to develop. You're talking kind of, $3 billion for a new drug on average, maybe more, and it takes maybe 15 years. Whereas if you're looking at an existing drug and wanting to show that works, that only might cost you 30 million or so and take you around 3 years versus 15 years. Also, most of the drugs actually out there are off patent, so 90% of prescriptions are off patent, but you can't really use patents to stop people from using an old drug in a new way. If somebody figured out that aspirin could, treat cancer very effectively, you can't really stop people just buying aspirin and treating, the disease with aspirin. So effectively and this is something the Web3 folks talk about a lot, is public goods. This is a public goods problem, essentially. It's a bit like open source software, whereby, how do we generate the information? How do we generate the data, that valuable data, to show that these off-patent drugs or low-cost therapies like a diet or a supplement are effective? And that's, and how can we create a sustainable economic business model around that, and sustainable economic system? So we can use blockchain for some of this stuff. The main one, I think, the thing that got everyone into blockchain originally is this kind of speculative aspect, but essentially getting access to funding. But then more recently, this as the DeSci movement, early pioneers in the DeSci movement, Molecule and VitaDAO, sort of offshoot of their platform, looking at the idea of IP NFTs, where essentially you have an NFT that links to a source of clinical trial data, and then you can essentially financialize something that previously wasn't really able to be a product. It could be pre-patent clinical data, and then eventually, and this is the area where I'm interested in, is that clinical data could be even relating to a diet or an off-patent drug, and you could, if you had a way of essentially putting a value or price on that clinical data, then you could create a market for it. And also generally, I think the Web3 community is very aligned with the idea of open source medicine, open source developing open source projects, and particularly the refi space around funding new ways of funding public good, like the folks Gitcoin and GitEth and those folks. So what we're basically interested in is in one of the solutions. It's you've got different names for it, but essentially like a prize. But in the Web3 space, it could be called retroactive public goods funding, like the Optimism network is actually doing a retro PGF project now. But essentially, you're paying people for an outcome. So you've got a payer that basically says, hey, we're going to pay for this public good if you do it. And then that then creates a market for folks to actually come in and fund that public good. So that's called a pay for success contract, but you could call it a prize, you could call it retro PGF, but that's the idea. And say in the instance of medicine, how does this actually work? Say we've got an off-patent drug that we want to prove is effective, and it could be a very effective treatment. It could maybe treat a cancer or depression or longevity drug, but we can't, as an investor, first you've got the doctor there. He's saying he can't treat these diseases. He can't really prescribe an off-patent drug. He has to do that at his or her own risk, because they don't really know if it works or not. Investor wants to invest in off-patent drugs, but they can't really get a return on investment if it's so cheap. And the insurers they want people to invest in off-patent drugs because they could save so much money if they could treat people with these cheap treatments, and they could save a lot of hospitalization costs. So they get together and they say, the insurer says, okay, I've got this bag of money. Basically, they're the retroactive funders. And if your trial of an off-patent drug or a public good medicine is successful, open source medicine, then we'll give you this much money. And the investor says, that's fine, we'll invest this much because we're used to taking this sort of risk. And they give it to an independent contract research organization basically to do this treatment. And then the CRO says, wow, it's successful. And the insurer gives the investor the retroactive funding. And then the insurer can tell the doctors, hey, look, this is what the trial's done, and they can go and prescribe it, and that reduces hospitalizations and actually helps make the health insurers more profitable. So that's like an actual scalable business model for open source medicine. So we think a lot of this could be also powered by Web3. You've got a lot of fundraising going on, people buying pictures of apes. What if people would buy NFTs representing an open source treatment, like basically retro PGF for open source pharma NFTs? And what would a cure or a treatment, a low cost treatment for depression, be worth to you? Also the VitaDAO ecosystem. So that's what I mentioned before. They're one of the kind of basically the first real DeSci DAO that's operational and been deploying quite a bit of funding now. They raised sort of 5 million, and they've raised more money actually from Pfizer as well. And I think recently did another fundraise, but they've deployed quite a lot of money, and this pros really focused on the longevity space, which is traditionally not really not really focused. Essentially, there's not a lot of funding going into those space, although there is more now. And they are using the IP NFT framework to also facilitate that. So my idea around crowdfunding cures, what we want to do is a little bit different. It's more like funding open source medicines. So VitaDAO was more involved, like the sort of more traditional type funding, for patented drugs. But with this medical impact DAO, essentially you're crowdfunding almost like a prize fund, and then that would then you could have essentially people investing, say for a medical prize to treat depression with open source psychedelic medicine. And we've actually got a project that we're running now on that, and we're trying to doing an allow list at the moment. And when there's sort of this prize fund available, if people fund a clinical trial, say of at least 100 people, and you get a good result, then the percentage increase in your result versus usual care. So the percentage improvement in those patients versus usual care will give you a number of points, and that will convert into a hypercert. And then that would basically determine your allocation of how much funding you'll get from the medical prize fund for that year. So essentially just, same thing, creating a market, a retroactive PGF essentially for public good medicines, but you can run this through as a DAO. Advantages of Web3. So you've got, as I was saying, these open source pharma NFTs. You can have fractionalized ownership of on-chain, of clinical trial data that's held on chain or referenced on chain. You get that liquidity in there, sort of get the markets involved. You can create a market for open source medicines, open source pharma. And then DAOs can also provide an opportunity for decentralized governance. And also, actually, the other important thing I think about blockchain and particularly clinical data is it allows the clinical data is very important to the FDA and regulators. It's immutable and it's auditable, which is a really good thing for preventing fraud and things like that. So there's a lot of non-trivial use cases for why Web3 would be involved. In one of our partners, Remedy, spelled with a Y, is actually looking at this and already implementing and already holding clinical data on chain also in a way that's HIPAA compliant and GDPR compliant. So the traditional sort of one of the questions is, why not just raise money like a charity and just give out grants? With this sort of retroactive pay for success model, you're basically getting the private impact investors involved. There's a transfer of risk from, say, the charity for government funding to the markets. Markets have better technology, free markets better allocating resources. And Also, I think most importantly, this is a unique opportunity which the private markets haven't really put money or put capital and attention into. So I think that's the most exciting thing, is it could be some really, really low hanging fruit. We're talking like, amazing treatments, low cost treatments for repurposed generic drugs, or, psychedelic medicine like ketamine. Ketamine is a very, very low cost drug that can treat depression. Very low cost, versus the patented version, which is called esketamine, which is around 40 times the cost. So some really cheap and low cost, low hanging fruit there. Also, as I was saying before, the costs of drug development are a lot more expensive on the traditional pathway. If we can figure out a way to create this open source business model, we could get develop drugs at a fraction of the cost to the traditional patent model. And there's just a lot of off-patent drugs out there, and diets and supplements and non-profitable therapies, which could generate trillions of dollars worth of savings basically for the government. I mean, at the moment, the amount of spending on pharmaceuticals, patented drugs is around $1 trillion a year. All the patented drugs is around $500 billion, maybe $600 billion. But because a lot of the spending most of the spending is actually on the patented drugs, but there's still a lot of spending on off-patent drugs. But yeah, easily just a massive cost-saving opportunity if we can actually capture some of that cost saving. So yeah, this isn't sort of this. There are actually opportunities out there. It comes out almost every week. I get them sent to me almost every week, every day. Stories about off-patent or low-cost therapies that could be effective. But what happens? The story comes out. There's usually the researcher complains that no one's funding their study because it's not profitable, and then that's the end of that. And it just there's just literally thousands of these opportunities on the shelves. Some of them I'll talk about there. Oxyphenobutazone for drug-resistant tuberculosis, and low-dose naltrexone for chronic pain, and clomipramine for brain tumors. Also in the longevity space, I know there's a bit of overlap with the longevity folks and Web3, but there's most of the longevity drugs out there actually off patent. So particularly rapamycin, NMN, resveratrol, metformin, vitamin D. All of these treatments are off patent. Also things like diets, looking at diets and supplements. And you've got people spending millions of dollars sometimes even on these treatments, just experimenting on themselves. But it would be not really. No one's really thinking about generating a market to actually generate the data to prove that these off-patent treatments work. And I think there'll be a lot of upside for that. So I don't know if we've
Cool. This is such amazing information. I think there's a few things that you emphasized that I would like to highlight. One of which is we talked a lot about the incentive misalignment. And so there's something around blockchain that's helping coordinate incentive alignment between different stakeholders, including patients. And we talked a lot about the different ways that blockchain can now be a new publishing model for IP, right? And so there's a lot of things within blockchain that helps decentralize science. So relative to traditional science, where it's a closed, smaller group that has centralized control of funds, the distribution of funds here would be determined by the public, right? Using some form of a DAO or some quadratic funding. It seems like there's also a coordination metric here where people are able to collaborate sort of outside the limit of a institution. And then there's funding decisions that are made online and more transparently with new funding mechanisms that are now basically being innovated on. Whereas before, it was probably one pharma that had a really long turnaround time, and their decisions were probably very guided by patent laws, for instance. And so I think the point that we're trying to make here is that decentralized science is not only building infrastructure, public infrastructure for funding, but it's also creating more innovative models to review, publish, store, and even disseminate scientific knowledge and collaboration using the blockchain stack. Anyway, that was a really amazing presentation. I think you shared a lot. I think now we're going to move into the Q&A portion of this workshop. And of course, if this conversation inspires new questions, please drop them in our Discord section of our chat. But I have some gathered questions from the community, and I'll pepper in some questions of my own. But I think the first thing I would love for you to cover is if you could just give us an example of something either that your companies have worked on, or maybe something that VitaDAO has worked on, and how that process from funding to market had worked.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess, well, one of the first examples probably would be the VitaDAO DAO. I mean, that's when they raised, you know, 5 million or so to help with longevity research. One of the first projects they funded was Morten Shelby Knudsen, but he's quite a well-known longevity researcher, one of the most well-known. And they basically minted an IP NFT, which represented the data coming out of his lab, ironically for some off-patent drugs that they're looking at. But they're more looking at, you know, can we patent, you know, can we do a reformulation of those? And then that's since then, you know, they've been looking at fractionalizing those IP NFTs and trading them as tokens, essentially. So that's one of the kind of classical kind of DeSci sort of, or at least the first sort of iteration, as it were. My project is a bit sort of not as advanced, but we're actually moving more towards the Web 2 side of things. I think it's, you know, it's still a bit of a tough sell, really, to get people to crowdfund towards, you know, open source medicine, or purchasing, you know, an open source NFT. But that's what we were trying to do, essentially, for psychedelic medicine. So we worked with an artist to create 1,001 pieces of using DALL-E of psychedelic art, great art pieces, and to raise funding for a open source psychedelic medicine medical prize fund, which would be able to fund, say, research into ketamine and psilocybin, a lot of low cost treatments for, or even you know, not even psychedelics, but combined with traditional therapies. Also, we were looking at we're working with VitaDAO on a generic drug repurposing prize. So being, you know, that's a bit of also another side project, but essentially where we there was some money raised through Gitcoin for a longevity prize, and there were conversations about putting that into as a generic drug repurposing longevity prize. There are actually they're not really DeSci, but it's actually X Prize has got a HealthSpan X Prize with $101 million, and they're talking about you know, also allowing access or making access a really important aspect of longevity, because I think that's a lot of people pushing back on the whole idea that just longevity is a bunch of billionaires, you know, trying to live as long as they can so they can hoard all their money. And I think that's a, you know, legitimate point, is that, you know, if we do come up with a longevity treatment, it should be something that's available to everybody. So so yeah, I think in the DeSci, well, there are lots of other projects in the DeSci space also working with DeSci World, the stuff that you're talking about around creating knowledge and sort of ways of essentially validating and rewarding the generation of knowledge. And I know Protocol Labs also have been very interested in the idea of impact markets, which is essentially the same thing we've been talking about, where you're creating a market for generating scientific data and outside the kind of traditional publish or perish model where you're getting grant funding and you're not necessarily being rewarded for actually generating useful data. It's just really impact, which sometimes, you're actually, it's been shown more recently, there's been a lot of scandals, particularly it's for Alzheimer's, where there's been fake data and it's set people down the wrong path for like 20 years, where they're looking at this amyloid hypothesis for Alzheimer's, and a lot of it was based on some fake data, and so there are people, I think, definitely in the Web3 space, and particularly Juan Benet, also from Protocol Labs, very interested in these sort of problems and these bottlenecks, and how do we use new funding mechanisms to basically and Web3 to kind of overcome these bottlenecks. So essentially, ultimately become more efficient. I think that's really, and by removing those kind of middlemen.
Yeah.
So yeah, a lot of interesting stuff going on.
I think VitaDAO is a super interesting example because not only are they, sort of at the forefront of DeSci around longevity, but they're also a lot of their backing has come from Pfizer, right? So they're working with very established pharma companies as well. But the whole concept of Vita is they closed, X million of funding, and then they will they are governed by this token Vita, and then the community gets to vote on which projects they want to fund. And they're specifically focused on contributions to longevity, but they're also focused on like very moonshot type projects for longevity, right? And the whole idea is, can they give 100K, 200K, 300K to really grand ideas where these projects could effectively, like in a traditional sense, they're sort of in this like valley of death stage where the research is super unproven and nobody wants to invest resources into that type of a stage. And so they're basically sort of creating this environment where they're empowering individuals and people with the capital to explore their wildest ideas to advance medicine. So I think that in general is a very interesting concept. But I guess I would love to move on to some other questions. From your perspective, I'm curious, like, how familiar is the broader scientific community with DeSci, and what I know it's pretty hard to categorize this, but how high is the awareness of DeSci with current scientists?
Yeah, I mean, 2022, I was going to a bunch of kind of conferences, or mainly crypto ones, but a few like scientific ones as well. And I have to say, as you're saying, kind of 2022, as you say, Denver is kind of the first sort of inkling of it, and so we're still very new. I think, and then last year, sort of there are a few, as that's around Art Basel in Miami, and talking about it there, and there wasn't a lot of sort of understanding of that, and specifically in the scientific community, even in Web3, there's not a lot of understanding of
Right.
what DeSci is. But it's getting there, and I think personally, it's a really it's a fantastic area to get into. But for scientists, I'd say not a lot. I mean, unless they're crypto enthusiasts. But what I've found is that the academics that I do talk to, the ones you're very polarized. You've got people that are very pretty anti because of a lot of the negative press. And then the ones that are into it are actually really into it, and especially because they're kind of up against the wall, and particularly younger scientists, they're really, you know, they've got some very hard choices, and particularly, you know, they might get their first NIH grant by the time they're 40, and they've got to, like, you know, pay for like 3 postdocs and things like that, and just a very, very hard sort of career. And outside of a few areas, you know, maybe like Boston, you know, SF, and you know, maybe Cambridge and places like that, you can make a career out of being a scientist, but it's pretty tough out there. And so I think there's been a lot of interest in the idea of just looking at Web3 and DeSci as a funding mechanism first and foremost. As you're saying, you know, it's a way of kind of getting, you know, grant funding. When you've got a 10% chance of getting a grant, it might take you 3 months. It's been very, very fast, relatively speaking, to get grants out of organizations like DeSci organizations like VitaDAO, for example. So there's that's a great area. Also, yeah, VitaDAO, I mean, they I think they've had a few mentions in like Nature magazine. So there's a lot of, you know, people, they're on the radar, I can imagine, you know. And as far as, I think, as you know, and DeSci, I think, as an ambassador for Web3 generally, I think it's going to be a good one. I think that scientists have this kind of they're kind of trained to be a little bit open-minded and look at the data and look at what works, and basically, you know, look at the big picture. But also, you know, you can have your projects and your ideas, but basically you've got a way of kind of working together and for the greater good. I think scientists have sort of built this, you know, amazing system of the scientific method and peer review, and it's kind of this kind of self-organizing DAO in a way. And so I think they kind of inherently understand this idea of, hey, we should have these ways of coordinating, cooperating with each other for the greater good. So yeah, if we can pull it off and get some big science DAOs going, I think it's going to be really great for the Web3 community. Yeah.
I think there's a few other like Web2 challenges that you touched in there that you didn't touch on in your presentation, which is, one, it sounds like scientists now can spend a greater portion of their time actually doing science versus like applying for funding, whereas today it's much harder to get funding in the traditional sense. It sounds like too that now really like people can work on anything that excites them, and the science is sort of decoupled from institutions, right? Because now there's new ways for scientists to get paid and incentivized for their work. And there's also this idea that now the data and the resources are open in this like DAO community, and that is openly published and communicated, whereas that has historically not been as transparent. And I guess there's a few different ways I can go with the next set of questions, but I think the direction I want to touch on is the challenges of DeSci. And so my first question here is really like, DAOs have historically in crypto not been effective in consistency, right? There's definitely examples of DAOs that are really effective, but for the most part, it seems like the coordination, decision-making, and the participation from the broader swath of the community sort of drops off over time. And I wonder, from your participation with DeFi or DeSci DAOs, if you're seeing the same, or is the trend here different?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, this is the core issue with Web3, I think, in general, and I think this is kind of where I'm coming at things from a different perspective. So as a lawyer, you know, as an in-house lawyer, I kind of understand sort of say how to set up, say, codes of conduct and disciplinary procedures and things like that, like when things go wrong. Like that's really the key with a lot of organizations. Like, how do you actually resolve disputes. And so, and you can't just magically think a DAO is gonna do that. And particularly where a lot of people are like anons, and you've got a lot of power being held by people, and forming syndicates, and a lot of that might not be that transparent. So you get a lot of these kind of power sort of structures and things, which aren't necessarily a bad thing, but they can be a bad thing where it ends up basically where people no longer can cooperate anymore for the greater good. I think that's the problem, and I think that's what happened with a lot of DAOs is, they raised, hundreds of millions of dollars, let's say, but then it's held in a multi-sig with like 5 people, and they don't really have a written agreement between themselves, and any of those people can just defect, or a group of those people can defect. And then, what's the kind of tie between what the community says and what they say? And yeah, so coordinating people is hard. It's a difficult problem. And, companies were an interesting solution, invention, sort of 400 years ago to kind of do that and to help people allocate capital. And they've had hundreds of years of jurisprudence to kind of help with that and have the board and have the shareholders and things. And DAOs to some extent kind of reflect that, having the multi-sig, I guess it's a little bit like having a board and then having the community there. So in a way, I think it's, we are really, I do think, but yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I think that the main thing is, the main problem, I think, with a lot of these communities and all communities and any kind of spontaneously generated communities, you tend to just, there is a centralizing element always, even though there's kind of decentralized, but it's just a natural thing that some people care more about a project and they put more effort in. And then there's other, elements where some people might care more about, they just want to be in a position of power, let's say, or something like that. And then that kind of creates those tensions as well. But that's not unique, look at Game of Thrones and all that stuff, or the remake and things like that. And you see that all the horrible stuff people do to kind of, because it's just human. It's just a way of self-organizing. But I hope that norms and standards will appear eventually, and I think codes of conduct will go a long way. And having quite clear disciplinary proceedings if something goes wrong, I think that's where lawyers kind of, that's where we get involved in. But ideally, what we're trying to do actually is to help resolve disputes. And I think having those kind of norms, I think that's going to help a lot. But on the other hand, I mean, we've seen this actually with crowdfunding, which has been very interesting to me. We have crowdfunding projects like on Kickstarter or whatever, and you've got 1,000 eyes on your project. It's actually quite self-policing. So, you do have scams and things like that and people sort of rugging and running off and vaporware, etc. But not as many as you'd think. And there's probably been a lot more in the kind of traditional kind of Web 2 space or Silicon Valley, projects sort of raising money and not actually delivering. So yeah, it's a difficult question. I think just the main thing is if you like a project, get involved and really try and set up rules for norms for the organization, and try not to generate silos and be as transparent as possible, and kind of and I think with the Web3 people, we've got a kind of almost like we're trying to do it better. Like that's the whole point. So we shouldn't fall into the same traps, and we should really think about the big picture. But on the other hand, sort of the problem is a lot of the people that made a lot of money in Web3, people maybe more naturally speculating and things like that, and that's sort of degen kind of people, and so they hold a lot of power, and maybe those people are not as pro-social, but maybe they are. But again, it's a difficult question, I have to say. Yeah.
It does make sense that there's still challenges with the DAO organization system in DeSci, and of course, it is also, if you think about it, like, can non-scientists distinguish high quality projects from bad ones? that's also questionable, right? And then there's also challenges like even getting a scientist to adopt crypto, which we haven't even discussed. But moving on to a couple more questions and then we'll wrap up. I have this question here about blockchain, and you touched on this in your presentation, which is how can you distinguish the scenario where blockchain is integral to the success of a DeSci project or just a science project versus one where it's like one where you can have Web 2 alternatives, right? Because you touched on crowdfunding as an alternative to funding, but how do you distinguish where blockchain is more integral?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's the more interesting stuff for me was the access to capital, like the sort of ICO days, and I don't know, it might happen again, but where you can just issue a token for a particular project and raise kind of a lot of money just based on, say, memes and things like that. So in that sense, it's very powerful. It democratizes access to liquidity, essentially. So I think that's not something. I mean, you could say that's that could be done through crowdfunding, but not so much. Not in the sense that. But that's more of an regulatory arbitrage type of thing, and now actually a lot of the regulators are coming down on that sort of thing, so it's becoming a lot more difficult to do these kinds of token raises and things like that. But the possibility is there, and it is possible to do compliant raises. So I think in that sense it's quite interesting, and IPNT framework I think is a good model for that. As I was saying before, I think that integral. Looking at data integrity, actually, one of the issues around scientific fraud, there's a lot of scientific fraud going on with the incentives because of this publish or perish idea where basically, scientists, in order to get a grant, they want to get a paper in a prestigious journal. In order to do that, they have to show some interesting result. And I think with blockchain, where you can, and there's some projects working, I think, DeSci Labs, and looking at these kinds of things where you can basically create a new kind of paper where you can drill down and go into the data and have access to raw data, and then have a sort of like a version control type of situation where people can update and upload things and collaborate. And I think blockchain inherently has that kind of version control built in, because it's this immutable, auditable record. And I was alluding to that before. Actually, the FDA are kind of quite interested in blockchain as a technology, for holding clinical trial data. And as I was saying, this organization we're working with, partnered with Remedy. One of the co-founders actually in Public Good Pharma, Jason Cross, Dr. Jason Cross, he's also co-founder there. That's what he pointed out, is that that's one of the areas where the FDA are like, we really like blockchain because of its ability to be used as a way of storing immutably and auditably storing clinical data. So and that's most of science is like that as well. So definitely some opportunities there.
Cool. One last question and then we'll wrap up. So this is a quick summary question, which is if you could just summarize from your perspective, what potential does DeSci have to change scientific exploration and modernize and aid modern science?
Well, I think it would be amazing if it really got traction, to the sense of, say, a DeFi, where you've got billions of dollars being poured into scientific projects, because science and technology and science science is really what helps us push forwards. And I mean, other than more, I mean, there's a lot of controversy around, say, AGI getting out of control, but that could be a good issue for DeSci as well, like particularly on the governance aspect. Like, can we make it, how do we make an AGI that we can all like help align and it's not like owned by one corporation or something like that. So I think I mean, personally, I think that as a technology, the sky's the limit if we can, work out how to coordinate and get some good folks and some good projects going and get some really good results. I think it's going to be a really good thing for the Web3 community generally. Particularly, funding open source medicines, that could be a good one. But we'll see.
Well, amazing. We're going to wrap up. So if you have any additional questions as you watch the recording, please drop them in our Discord and we will get answers for you asynchronously. Of course, we'll also do a recap via our blog where we take a deeper dive into DeSci. So watch out for that. But Sava, thanks for being with us here tonight. The very last question for you is, what resources would you recommend for individuals who are looking to dip their feet into DeSci?
I mean, there's some summary. I think the Ethereum website has a summary on DeSci, which is a good summary. Look at what Protocol Labs are doing around impact markets. There's a few projects. DeSci World has a great list of DeSci projects. Get into the Discords. You can check out the VitaDAO Discord. It's a very active community. Just I want to say, but Google it. But it's probably quite a few resources out there, I'd imagine.
Amazing. We'll link some in our newsletter that comes out later today. And then thanks again for being with us. And we will see you next week for our next workshop.